The house was too big for one man. That was the first thought that crossed Arthur's mind every single morning when he woke up. The silence in the bedroom was heavy, like a thick blanket that you couldn't pull off your face. He used to wake up to the sound of soft breathing beside him, or maybe the quiet click of a closet door as his wife got dressed to start the day. Now, there was nothing. Just the sun coming through the curtains, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air, and the feeling that time was standing still. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He was 82 years old, and his joints clicked and popped when he moved. He rubbed his hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his chin. He knew he should get up, shower, and put on one of his nice shirts. He knew he should go downstairs and eat breakfast. But most days, it was hard to find a reason to do any of it. The house felt like a museum. Every picture on the wall, every vase on the shelf, every piece of furniture was exactly where she had left it. If he moved things, it felt like he was erasing her. If he left them, it felt like he was living in a graveyard. He finally stood up, his knees letting out a low groan in protest. He walked over to the window and looked out at the garden. It was a large garden, or at least it used to be. Now the hedges were growing a little wild, and the flowers in the beds looked tired. He hadn't touched a garden tool in 2 years. He watched a squirrel run along the top of the fence, twitching its tail. The squirrel had a purpose. It was looking for food, looking for a mate, looking for a place to build a home. Arthur felt like he had no purpose at all. He turned away from the window and made his way to the bathroom. The tiles were cold on his bare feet. He looked in the mirror and saw an old man staring back. His hair was white and thin, his eyes were a watery blue, and deep lines were carved around his mouth. It wasn't that he hated being old, it was just that he didn't know how to be old alone. For 45 years, he had been a husband. Before that, a father. Before that, a son. Now, he was just Arthur. After washing his face and combing his hair, he got dressed. He chose a pair of gray trousers and a light blue sweater. He used to wear suits every day, but now, comfortable clothes seemed more important. There was no one to impress anymore. He walked out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The hallway was long and wide, with a carpet that ran down the center like a red river. As he walked, his steps echoed. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was lonely. He passed the guest room, which was always empty. He passed the room where his daughter used to stay when she visited from the city, though she hadn't been back in months. She was busy with her career, her own children, her own life. He didn't blame her. He knew that young people had to live their lives, they couldn't spend all their time sitting in the dark with an old man, but the loneliness still ached in his chest, sharp and constant. At the end of the hallway, he paused. There was a large archway that led to the main living room. This was the room where they used to entertain guests on Christmas and Easter. It was the room where they would sit by the fire on winter evenings. Now, the furniture was covered in white sheets to keep the dust off. It looked like a room full of ghosts. Arthur quickly walked past it. He didn't like looking at the sheet-covered sofas. He went down the stairs, holding onto the banister tightly. His balance wasn't what it used to be. When he reached the bottom, the smell of the house hit him. It was a smell of lemon polish and old wood. It was a clean smell, but it didn't smell like a home. It smelled like a place that was waiting for something to happen. In the kitchen, he found his coffee waiting for him. It was in a thermos to keep it hot. Beside the thermos was a plate with a croissant and a bowl of fruit. This was the work of the woman who came in to clean. Her name was Mrs. Gable. Arthur didn't know much about her. He knew she was quiet. He knew she was fast. He knew she came 3 times a week. He would hear the front lock click open in the morning, and for a few hours, the house would come alive with the sounds of sweeping, vacuuming, and water running in the sink. Then, the lock would click again, and she would be gone. Sometimes, Arthur would hide in his study just to avoid the awkwardness of saying hello. He felt guilty about it. He knew she was a person with a life and a story, but he was so wrapped up in his own sadness that he didn't have the energy to ask her how she was. He treated her like a part of the house, a machine that came in to fix the mess he was making. He knew it wasn't right, but grief made people selfish in ways they didn't expect. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the small kitchen table. The chair felt hard. He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and bitter, just the way he liked it. He looked at the fruit bowl. There was a shiny red apple and a bunch of green grapes. Mrs. Gable must have gone to the market for him. She was thoughtful. He made a mental note to thank her next time he saw her, knowing he would probably forget the moment the thought left his head. The kitchen was bright, but it felt cold. In the corner of the room sat an old radio. Arthur stood up and walked over to it. His fingers hesitated over the dial. Music used to be the center of his life. He had played the cello when he was younger. He and his wife used to go to the symphony. They would dress up, hold hands, and let the music wash over them. But after the funeral, he couldn't listen to it anymore. Every sad song felt like it was mocking him, and every happy song felt like a lie. It was easier to just have silence. He turned the radio on, but he kept the volume low. It was a classical station. A violin was playing something slow and sweet. He stood there for a moment, listening. For a second, he felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered the way his wife used to hum while she cooked breakfast. She couldn't sing very well, and she couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but he had loved it. It was the sound of happiness. He quickly turned the radio off. The silence rushed back in, filling the room instantly. Arthur walked back to the table and sat down. He broke off a piece of the croissant and put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly, not really tasting it. He looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard. There was a stone bench under a large oak tree. That was where she used to sit to read in the summers. The bench was empty now, covered in a layer of green moss. He sighed. It was going to be another long day. He had no errands to run. He had no phone calls to make. He just had to exist until the sun went down and he could go back to bed. He finished his coffee and stood up to rinse his cup. As he placed the cup in the sink, he heard a noise from the front of the house. Click. The front door was opening. Arthur froze. It was Tuesday. Mrs. Gable always came on Tuesdays. But it was still early. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was only 8:30. She usually didn't arrive until 9. He listened closely. He heard the soft scuff of shoes on the entryway mat. He heard the heavy thud of a bag being set down. He felt a sudden urge to go out and greet her. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today he would ask her about her day. Maybe he would offer her a cup of coffee. He wanted to break the pattern. He wanted to feel like a human being again. He wiped his hands on a towel and walked out of the kitchen, into the hallway. He stopped when he saw her. Mrs. Gable was standing near the closet, taking off her coat. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a plain gray skirt and a white blouse. She looked tired. Her shoulders were slumped forward, and she moved slowly as she hung up her coat. Arthur watched her from the shadows of the hallway. He felt a sudden wave of shame. Here was this woman, coming to his house to work, probably tired before her day even started, and he had never once offered her a kind word or a comfortable chair. He wondered if she had family waiting for her at home. He wondered if she was lonely too. She took a cleaning caddy out of her large bag and set it on the floor with a metallic clatter. She adjusted her bun, took a deep breath, and turned toward the living room. She hadn't seen him yet. Arthur opened his mouth to say good morning. He wanted to bridge the gap between them. He wanted to step out of the bubble of his own grief. But then, he stopped. He saw her face. It was set in a hard line, focused and serious. She was there to work. She was in her zone. If he interrupted her now, would it be a kindness, or would it just be an annoyance he didn't know? He didn't know the rules of social interaction anymore. His courage failed him. He felt small and foolish. He stepped back into the kitchen, hiding behind the door frame. He listened as the vacuum cleaner roared to life in the distance. The noise was loud and intrusive, but it was better than the silence. It was the sound of life, of movement, of things getting clean. Arthur went back to the table and sat down. He put his head in his hands. He had almost spoken to her. He had almost done something normal. But he had retreated, back into his shell. He told himself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would be the man he used to be. But deep down, he knew that as long as he stayed in this house, surrounded by memories and silence, he would never change. He sat there for an hour, just listening to the sounds of Mrs. Gable working. He heard the vacuum move up the stairs. He heard the sound of water sloshing in a bucket. He heard the soft rhythm of a broom brushing against the floor. These were the sounds of his life now. They were the soundtrack to his loneliness. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine that the noise was actually the bustle of a family home, that the footsteps upstairs belonged to his daughter, that the smell of lemon polish was actually the smell of dinner cooking. But the fantasy was too weak to hold onto. When he opened his eyes, the empty kitchen stared back at him. Arthur was alone, and the house was just a house. The sun was high in the sky by the time the morning turned into afternoon. Inside the house, the light had changed. It was no longer the soft, pale yellow of the morning, it was a harsher, brighter white that streamed through the windows and illuminated every speck of dust that Mrs. Gable had missed. Arthur was still sitting at the kitchen table. He hadn't moved much. He had finished his coffee hours ago. The cup was empty, a dark stain drying at the bottom where the last drop had sat. He was tired, but it wasn't a physical tiredness that sleep could fix. It was a heaviness that sat in his bones. He often felt like he was carrying a backpack filled with stones, and every step he took required extra effort just to keep moving. He looked at his hands. They were veined and spotted with age. He remembered when these hands were strong. He used to be able to fix things around the house. He could repair a leaky faucet or sand down a rough table edge. Now, his hands shook when he tried to do small tasks. He felt useless. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. The sound seemed to bounce off the walls, reminding him again of how empty the place was. He needed to move. He couldn't just sit in the kitchen all day staring at a fruit bowl. He decided to go to the conservatory. It was a room on the other side of the house that his wife had loved. It was filled with plants, or at least it used to be. Now, it was mostly just dirt in pots and a few stubborn ferns that refused to die. He walked slowly through the hallway. The house felt incredibly vast. It was strange how a place could feel so crowded with memories and yet so empty of people. As he passed the living room, he noticed that the white sheets were gone. Mrs. Gable must have taken them off to wash or shake them out. The sofas were exposed. They looked worn and sagging without their covers. It made the room look vulnerable, like someone without their coat on in the winter. He didn't stop there. He kept walking, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the floor. Tap. Drag. Tap. Drag. It was the sound of his life now. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and balance. He finally reached the conservatory. The air in here was warmer and more humid than the rest of the house. The windows were covered in grime, so the light coming in was foggy and dim. He sat down on a wicker chair that creaked under his weight. In front of him was the view of the backyard. He looked at the garden again. It was overgrown. Weeds were growing in the flower beds, choking out the roses his wife had planted. The grass was too long. He should hire a gardener. He had the money. There was no reason to let the house fall apart except that he just couldn't bring himself to care enough to make the phone call. Letting it go to ruin felt appropriate, in a way. If she wasn't here to enjoy it, why should it be beautiful? Arthur leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. He let out a long, slow breath. He tried to clear his mind, but thoughts kept drifting in like unwanted clouds. He thought about his daughter. He wondered what she was doing right now. Maybe she was eating lunch at a busy cafe. Maybe she was laughing with a friend. He realized he didn't even know her favorite restaurant anymore. He didn't know if she was happy or sad. He had pulled away from her after the funeral, pushing her away because looking at her was too painful. She looked so much like her mother. By the time he was ready to let people back in, everyone had gotten used to him not being there. Suddenly, a sound cut through the quiet of the afternoon. It was a thump, deep and resonant. Then, a cascade of notes. A chord. Arthur's eyes snapped open. He sat up straight, his heart suddenly beating faster. The sound had come from inside the house. It wasn't a bang of a falling object or the creak of floorboards. It was music. It was coming from the parlor. The parlor was the room next to the conservatory, separated only by a set of heavy velvet curtains that were usually pulled shut. In that room sat the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, black and shiny, with legs that looked like carved lion paws. It hadn't been played in years. Arthur couldn't even remember the last time anyone had lifted the lid. He certainly hadn't touched it. He used to play, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Another sound drifted through the curtains. A melody. It started low and sad, then climbed higher, dancing around the notes. It was intricate and fast. The person playing wasn't just hitting keys, they were playing with skill. Arthur turned his head toward the curtains, his brow furrowed in confusion. Who was in his house? He had a guest. He was sure of it. Maybe his daughter had come to surprise him and had let herself in. But no, she would have come to find him immediately. Maybe it was a professional tuner. Yes, that made sense. He must have forgotten that he scheduled a piano tuner to come and look at the instrument. It was the kind of thing he might have written down on a piece of paper and then lost. The music swelled. It wasn't just a simple tune being tested. The pianist was playing a piece of music. It was complex and emotional. Arthur knew a little about music. He knew that what he was hearing was difficult. The fingers moving across the keys must have been flying. The sound was rich and full, vibrating through the floorboards and into the solace of his feet. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. For years, he had hated music. It hurt too much. But hearing this, right now, in the quiet of his empty house, it didn't hurt. It felt like a presence. It felt like the house was waking up from a long sleep. The sound filled up all the empty spaces. It pushed the silence away. He stood up from the wicker chair. He wanted to see who was playing. He wanted to see the person who had brought this sound into his home. He grabbed his cane, gripping it tightly. He felt a sudden surge of energy, a spark of curiosity that he hadn't felt in a long time. He walked toward the velvet curtains that separated the conservatory from the parlor. He moved slowly, not wanting to make a noise and disturb the performance. As he got closer, the music became clearer. He could hear the hammer striking the strings. He could hear the subtle pedal changes that made the notes blend together smoothly. It was a professional. It had to be. The playing was too clean, too precise. It was a pianist, perhaps someone his daughter knew, maybe a music student or a professor from the local university. Maybe his daughter had sent them, maybe she thought he needed music, even if he didn't think so himself. It was a kind thought. Arthur reached the curtains. He paused for a moment, standing just inches away from the heavy fabric. He could smell the faint scent of old dust and the polish that Mrs. Gable used. The music paused for a brief second, and then launched into a faster, more energetic section. It was beautiful. It was alive. He imagined what the player looked like. He pictured a man in a sharp suit, maybe with long hair, focused intensely on the keys. Or perhaps a woman in an elegant dress, her back straight, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. He imagined a performer, someone who lived for the music. Someone who didn't carry the weight of the world on their shoulders like he did. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He realized he was nervous. He hadn't spoken to a stranger in weeks. What would he say? Hello, thank you for playing. It sounded too simple. That was beautiful. It didn't seem like enough. But he knew he had to say something. He had to acknowledge this gift that had wandered into his home. He slowly reached out his hand. His fingers trembled slightly as they grasped the edge of the velvet curtain. He took a deep breath. He pulled the fabric back just enough to peek into the room. The light in the parlor was different than in the conservatory. It was brighter, streaming in from the large street-facing windows. The piano was glowing in the sunlight. The keys looked like rows of white teeth. And there, sitting on the bench, was the source of the music. Arthur's eyes widened. He saw the back of the person. He saw the posture. He saw the movement of the arms. The music stopped for a brief moment as the player turned a page of sheet music that Arthur hadn't even noticed was there. He saw the familiar gray sleeve of a uniform blouse. He saw the small, silver hair bun pinned tightly at the back of the head. Arthur's breath caught in his chest. He blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. He looked down at the floor. Next to the piano bench wasn't a leather briefcase or a musician's bag. There was a plastic caddy filled with cleaning sprays, rags, and a feather duster. The music started up again, softer this time. A gentle, rolling melody that seemed to weep and sing at the same time. The hands were small and worn, the skin a bit loose around the knuckles, but they moved with a grace that belonged in a concert hall, not a living room. Arthur let go of the curtain. He took a step back, his mind racing. It couldn't be. It made no sense. The maid, the woman who cleaned his toilets and scrubbed his floors, the woman he had ignored for years. He listened again, really listened, stripping away his bias. The sound was undeniable. It was magnificent. It was professional. It was art. Arthur stood there in the shadow of the curtains, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The loneliness that had crushed him all morning was suddenly replaced by a burning curiosity. He felt like he had discovered a secret door in a house he had lived in for 50 years. He leaned forward, watching through the slight gap in the fabric, unable to look away. The music filled his ears, but it was the sight of those modest, working hands creating such beauty that truly shook him to his core. The music seemed to hang in the air, shimmering like gold dust in the sunlight. Arthur could not move. He was frozen in the space between the conservatory and the parlor, his hands still hovering near the heavy velvet curtain. His brain was trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. He watched the woman play. Her posture had changed completely. Earlier, when he had seen her in the hallway, she looked like a woman defeated by gravity, shoulders slumped, head down, moving as if the air around her was made of lead. But now, sitting on the piano bench, her spine was straight. Her neck was long and elegant. She held her head high, not in arrogance, but in a way that showed she was completely focused on the instrument. She looked 10 years younger. Arthur knew a little about the piano. He knew enough to understand that what she was doing was not easy. Her left hand was jumping across the lower keys, providing a deep, steady rhythm, while her right hand was dancing over the high notes, playing a melody that was fast and complicated. Her fingers were not stiff. They were fluid, curling and striking the keys with a natural softness that produced a sound like flowing water. He glanced down at the cleaning supplies again. The blue plastic caddy with the spray bottles of glass cleaner and wood polish sat on the floor like a forgotten child. A yellow duster was draped over the side of the caddy. The sight of those rough, chemical-smelling items next to the polished elegance of the grand piano was jarring. It was like seeing a diamond ring sitting in a bowl of soup. It just didn't make sense to him. In his world, people had boxes they fit into. The mailman delivered the mail. The doctor fixed his body. The maid cleaned the floors. Musicians were people he paid to see in theaters, people who wore tuxedos and bowed to applause. They did not scrub bathtubs. They did not carry cleaning caddies. He felt a strange mix of emotions. There was confusion, certainly. But there was also a strange sense of guilt. He had been paying this woman for years to clean his house, yet he had never once looked at her as a person with a talent. He had never asked her about her life. To him, she was just the help. Seeing her now, possessing a skill he could only dream of, made him feel small and foolish. The music shifted. It became slower, more serious. The notes were lower now, vibrating deep in the belly of the piano. It was a sad song, but it wasn't a heavy, ugly sadness. It was a beautiful, clean sadness. It was the kind of music that made you think of old memories and lost loves. Arthur felt a prickle of tears in the corners of his eyes. He hadn't cried in a long time, not since the funeral. He had been numb. But this music was melting the ice around his heart. He realized he was standing there spying on her. It felt rude. This was clearly a private moment for her. She wasn't performing for an audience. She was playing for herself, stealing a few moments of joy in a house that was usually empty of life. If he walked in now, he would ruin it. She would stop. She would be embarrassed. She would probably go back to being the quiet, tired woman who cleaned his floors. But he couldn't walk away. The pull of the music was too strong. He hadn't felt this connected to another human being in so long. He felt like he was witnessing a miracle. Arthur took a deep breath. He decided he had to let her know he was there. He couldn't just hide behind the curtain like a thief. He cleared his throat, loud enough to be heard over the fading notes of the song. The effect was instantaneous. The music stopped. It didn't wind down gradually, it ended with a sudden, sharp jolt. The last few notes were cut off as the player's hands snapped away from the keyboard as if they had been burned. Arthur stepped out from behind the curtain. The sight in the room changed instantly. The magic was gone. Mrs. Gable spun around on the bench, her face pale with shock. Her eyes were wide, darting around the room until they landed on Arthur. She immediately stood up, knocking the piano bench back a few inches. She smoothed down her skirt with frantic movements, trying to erase the image of the musician and replace it with the servant. "Oh, Mr. Vance," she stammered. Her voice was high and shaky, nothing like the confident, deep tone of the piano music. I am so sorry. I didn't hear you come in. I was just..." She looked around frantically for an excuse. She looked at the piano, then at her cleaning caddy, then at the floor. She couldn't find the words. She looked terrified. Her hands, which had been flying across the keys just seconds ago, were now clasped tightly together in front of her chest, twisting and wringing in fear. Arthur walked slowly into the room. He leaned heavily on his cane. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He could hear her breathing, fast and shallow. She looked like a child who had been caught with her hand in the cookie jar, except the stakes felt much higher. Arthur looked at the piano keys. They were still vibrating slightly. He looked at the woman. Up close, he could see the details he usually ignored. Her uniform was simple and worn. Her hands were red and rough, the skin chapped from the harsh cleaning chemicals she used every day. And yet, those hands had just created something divine. "I was just checking the keys," she lied poorly. To make sure they weren't dusty. You know, dust can damage the wood." It was a ridiculous lie, and they both knew it. But Arthur didn't call her out on it. He could see the genuine fear in her eyes. She was afraid she was going to lose her job. She was afraid she had overstepped her boundaries. Arthur looked at the bench. It was polished wood, but it was also worn. He walked over to it and slowly sat down. He groaned a little as his knees bent. Mrs. Gable took a step back, putting more distance between herself and the instrument. "I heard you from the conservatory," Arthur said. His voice sounded raspy, like he hadn't used it in days. I thought it was the radio. Or a guest." Mrs. Gable lowered her head. "I apologize, sir. I know I am not supposed to touch things that are not part of my cleaning duties. I will not do it again. Please, do not deduct it from my pay. I need this job." Her desperation hurt Arthur. He looked at her gray hair, pulled back so tight it must have given her a headache. He looked at her worn shoes. Here was a woman with a gift, a rare and beautiful talent, begging him not to fire her for using it. It felt wrong. It felt upside down. "You play very well," Arthur said quietly. He didn't say it as a compliment, exactly. He said it like a fact, like stating that the sky was blue or the grass was green. Mrs. Gable didn't say anything. She just stared at her shoes. Her face was turning red. She wasn't used to compliments. She was used to orders. Clean this. Fix that. She wasn't used to someone noticing her soul. Arthur stared at the keys. He reached out a trembling hand and hovered it over the ivory. He wanted to touch it. He wanted to feel the vibration again. But he pulled his hand back. He didn't trust himself to play. The music in his head was dead, he couldn't bring it out anymore. That song, Arthur said. What was it? Mrs. Gable shifted her weight from one foot to the other. It is just an old song. From my country. It is not famous. It was beautiful, Arthur said. He looked up at her. For the first time, he really looked at her face. He looked past the uniform and the tired eyes. He saw a woman who had a whole life outside of this house. A life that probably held sadness, just like his, but also held this music. He realized that while he was sitting in his kitchen feeling sorry for himself, she was in this room, pouring her heart out into a piano that wasn't even hers. Why do you hide it? Arthur asked. The question surprised him. He hadn't planned to ask it. It just slipped out. Mrs. Gable looked up, confused. Hide it, sir. The music, Arthur said. You are a professional. I can tell. You play better than most people I have heard. Why are you cleaning houses? He saw her mask slip for just a second. Her eyes lost that fearful, submissive look and flashed with something else: pain, pride, resignation. It was a window into a deep, complex story. The world changes, she said softly. And people change with it. My hands are for cleaning now. Music is for dreams. Dreams do not pay the rent. She picked up her caddy, signaling that the conversation was over. She was retreating back into her safety zone. I must finish the dusting in the library now, Mr. Vance. I am already behind schedule. She turned to leave. She moved quickly, her head down, eager to escape the room and the embarrassment of being seen. Wait, Arthur said. The word came out louder than he intended. Mrs. Gable stopped at the archway. She turned back, looking wary. Arthur looked at the empty space on the bench next to him. Then he looked at the piano. He felt a sudden, strong urge to keep the music alive. He didn't want to go back to the silence. He didn't want to go back to the kitchen and stare at the wall. Can you? Arthur started. He cleared his throat, feeling awkward. Can you play another one before you go back to work? Mrs. Gable looked at him, her mouth slightly open. She didn't know what to make of this request. The master of the house, the man who usually ignored her, was asking her to perform. It broke every rule of their relationship. But as she looked into his watery blue eyes, she saw something there that she recognized. She saw loneliness. It was the same loneliness that she felt when she played the piano alone in this empty room. She looked at the clock on the wall. I have 10 minutes, she said. Before I must go upstairs. 10 minutes is enough, Arthur said. She hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly walked back to the piano. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood for a moment, looking at the keys with respect. Then she sat down. She adjusted her bun. She took a deep breath. And just like that, the maid disappeared, and the musician returned. Arthur leaned back. He closed his eyes. He waited for the sound to wash over him again. The silence of the house was gone. The woman sat on the bench, her back rigid, her hands hovering over the keys. For a moment, she didn't play. She just breathed. Arthur watched her closely. He could see the conflict in her shoulders. Part of her wanted to run away, to pick up her cleaning bucket and disappear into the safety of the library where things made sense. But the other part of her, the part that was a musician, was rooted to the spot. The music was inside her, and it needed to get out. Arthur stayed quiet. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong word, one sound of annoyance or impatience, and she would stop forever. He realized he wasn't just an old man listening to a song anymore. He was a guest in her world, a world he had ignored for years. Then, her hands dropped. The notes that came out were different this time. They weren't fast and showy like the first song. These notes were slow, heavy, and dark. It sounded like a storm was coming, but the storm was still far away, just rumbling in the distance. Arthur closed his eyes again. He let the sound wrap around him. As he listened, Arthur's mind began to wander, but not to the sad places where it usually went. He started to wonder about her. He looked at her hands while they moved. They were not the hands of a lady of leisure. They were rough. The skin was dry and red, especially around the knuckles. There were calluses on her fingertips, but not the kind you get from playing piano. Those were from pressing down scrub brushes and wringing out mops. He thought about how much strength it must take to do her job. He struggled just to walk up the stairs with his cane. She spent all day climbing, lifting, bending, and scrubbing. And yet, here she was, using those tired, aching hands to create something so gentle. It made him feel ashamed of his own complaining. He had been sitting in his comfortable house, feeling sorry for himself because he was lonely, while she was working hard to survive. The music changed tempo. It became a little faster, a little more urgent. It sounded like a heartbeat. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He wanted to ask her so many questions. Where did you learn? How long have you played? Who taught you? But he kept his mouth shut. The music was doing the talking. He looked at her face. Her eyes were closed again. She wasn't looking at the keys. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where every note was. She was far away from this room. She was probably back in her home country, or maybe in a memory from a long time ago. Arthur tried to imagine her younger. Maybe she stood on a big stage once, wearing a long dress, with people clapping for her. Maybe she had dreams of being a famous performer. It didn't make sense to him that she was here. Why would someone with this much talent be cleaning his floors? Life wasn't fair, he knew that. He had lost his wife, which wasn't fair. But this felt different. It felt like a waste. It was like finding a Stradivarius violin in a trash pile. The song reached a high point, a loud, crashing chord that made the old piano rattle. Then, it softened again. It drifted down to the lower keys, deep and resonant. It felt like the music was sighing. Arthur looked around the room. The sun had moved across the floor. The dust motes were still dancing, but now they looked like they were dancing to her rhythm. The room didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. It felt like a sanctuary. He realized that the silence he had been protecting for 2 years wasn't peace, it was just emptiness. Real peace was this. Real peace was having something beautiful fill the space. The music began to slow down. The notes became further apart. She was ending the song. She played one last high note, very soft, and let it hang in the air until it faded away completely. Then, silence returned to the parlor. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a warm silence. A heavy silence, but not a sad one. It was the kind of silence you feel after a good rain, when the air is clean and fresh. Arthur felt like he could breathe easier. Mrs. Gable opened her eyes. She blinked a few times, as if she was waking up from a dream. She looked at her hands resting on her lap. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then, she seemed to remember where she was. She turned her head to look at Arthur. Her defensive walls were coming back up. She was waiting for his judgment. That was extraordinary, Arthur said. He meant every word. He didn't use fancy words because he didn't have any. He just spoke the truth. Mrs. Gable looked down at her shoes. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. She stood up quickly, moving away from the piano as if it had suddenly become hot. She went back to her plastic bucket and picked up her duster. "I really must go now," she said, her voice back to the flat, business-like tone she used when she was working. "The upstairs hallway will not clean itself." Arthur stood up too. He felt wobbly, his legs stiff from sitting still for so long. He gripped his cane. He didn't want her to leave. He was afraid that if she walked out that door, the magic would leave with her, and he would just be a lonely old man again. "How long?" Arthur asked. The question stopped her. She was half turned toward the door, but she paused. "How long have you been playing?" She didn't turn around fully. She looked at the wall, her eyes unfocused. "Since I was a little girl," she said. "My mother, she teach me. We had a piano in the living room. It was not a nice one like this. It was old. It had missing keys. But it was ours." She spoke quietly, but her voice had a different quality now. It was softer. It had a melody of its own. "I play every day," she continued. "When I am a child, I play for hours. My neighbors, they would come to the window and listen. They say I should go to the school for music. I wanted to go. But my family, we did not have money for such things." Arthur nodded slowly. He remembered a time when talent wasn't enough. You needed money, and you needed the right connections. It was a cruel fact of life. "I played for the church," she said, turning slightly so he could see her profile. "And then I teach the children. I have many students. I felt like I was somebody." She stopped there. She took a breath, and Arthur saw her face harden. She looked older now. The story wasn't going to be a happy one. He could feel it in the air. "But then, the trouble came," she said. She waved her hand a little, as if brushing away a fly. "In my country. The war. We had to leave. We left with nothing. Just one bag each. We come here." She looked down at her uniform. "Here, my papers, they are not the right papers for a teacher. The conservatories, they do not know me. They do not care. They say my method is old. They say I need new degrees. Who has time for degrees when you have to feed your family who has money for tuition?" She turned to Arthur, and for the first time, she looked him directly in the eye. There was a fire in her look now. A mix of pride and frustration. "So I clean," she said simply. "I clean because it is honest work. I clean because my hands can still move, and people will pay for that. But the music." She looked back at the piano. "The music, I keep in here." She pointed to her chest. "I play it in my head when I scrub the floors. I play it when I am on the bus. But my hands, they belong to the soap and the water now." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He had never thought about it like that. He had always assumed that people who cleaned houses did it because they weren't smart enough or talented enough to do anything else. It was a stupid, arrogant thought. Here was a woman who knew more about art and beauty than he ever would, scrubbing his toilet just to survive. It humbled him. "You still have the magic," Arthur said softly. "I heard it. It is still there." Mrs. Gable looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes softened. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Maybe," she said. "But it is like a light bulb without electricity. It is there, but it does not shine for anyone." She picked up her caddy. "I must go, sir. Please. Do not tell anyone. If the agency knows I play, if the other clients know, they might think I am distracted. I cannot lose this job." "I won't say a word," Arthur promised. She nodded. "Thank you." She walked past him, heading toward the door. Arthur watched her go. He watched her back, bent slightly from the weight of the cleaning supplies. But now, when he looked at her, he didn't see a maid. He saw a survivor. He saw a musician in disguise. "Mrs. Gable," he called out, just as she reached the hallway. She stopped and turned. "Yes, sir." "The piano," Arthur said. He gestured toward the bench. "It is just sitting there. It is lonely, I think." Mrs. Gable looked at the piano, then back at him. She didn't say anything. She just waited. Arthur took a breath. He felt nervous, like he was asking a girl to dance for the first time in 60 years. "If you have a moment, in the afternoons, when you are finished, you could play. If you want to. I won't disturb you. I will just listen from the other room. Or from the hallway." He paused. "I think the house would like it. The house has been too quiet for too long." Mrs. Gable stared at him. Her grip on the handle of her cleaning bucket tightened. She looked surprised. She looked hopeful. But then, her face shifted back to caution. "I don't know, sir," she said. "I have a schedule." "I know," Arthur said. "Just, if there is time. No pressure. No pay. Just music." She stood there for a long 10 seconds. She looked at the grand piano, sitting in the shaft of sunlight. She looked at Arthur, standing there with his cane, looking smaller than he usually did. "Perhaps," she said quietly. "Perhaps next Tuesday. If I finish the dusting early." Arthur felt a small spark of hope light up inside him. It was the first spark he had felt in years. "Next Tuesday," Arthur agreed. "I will look forward to it." Mrs. Gable nodded once, a sharp, professional nod. Then she turned and walked out of the room. Arthur listened to her footsteps going up the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. They sounded heavier now, burdened by the story she had just shared. But the room still felt warm. The ghost of the music was still there, floating in the air. Arthur walked back to the bench and sat down. He placed his hand on the smooth wood of the piano. He didn't play. He just sat there, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The days that followed were different. Arthur couldn't explain exactly how, but the atmosphere of the house had shifted. It was as if a window had been cracked open in a stuffy room, letting a fresh breeze circulate. Before, the house had felt like a tomb, quiet and cold. Now, it felt like it was waiting for something. It had a pulse. Arthur found himself changing his routine. On Tuesday mornings, he would wake up earlier than usual. He would shower and shave with a bit more care, making sure his shirt was tucked in neatly. He stopped hiding in his study when he heard the front lock click open. Instead, he would stay in the kitchen or the living room, reading a newspaper or a book, but mostly just listening. He would hear the sounds of Mrs. Gable working. He heard the vacuum humming upstairs, the mop swishing across the floor, the feather duster flicking against the picture frames. But he listened with new ears. He didn't just hear the noise of chores, he heard the rhythm of her day. He imagined her moving through the rooms, a woman with a grand history hidden under her apron. He felt a sense of respect that he had never felt before. When she would come into the room to dust, Arthur would make an effort to speak to her. It was small talk at first. He would ask if it was raining outside, or if the traffic was bad. Mrs. Gable would answer politely, "Yes, sir," or "No, sir," but she didn't offer more. She was still cautious. But Arthur noticed a small change in her eyes. She didn't look at the floor as much. She met his gaze for a second longer. She knew that he knew her secret, and that created a bridge between them. Then came the next Tuesday. Arthur was sitting in the conservatory, looking out at the garden. The sun was bright, and for once, he noticed that the weeds didn't look so terrible. They were just plants growing where they weren't supposed to. He heard the cleaning sounds stop. He heard the footsteps coming down the stairs and walking across the hallway. He heard the familiar click of her cleaning caddy being set down in the parlor. His heart beat a little faster. He stood up and walked to the curtain. He didn't feel like a spy this time. He felt like an audience member waiting for a concert to begin. He peeked through the gap in the fabric. Mrs. Gable was standing by the piano. She wasn't cleaning it. She was standing still, looking at the keys. She reached out and touched one white key, pressing it gently. A single note rang out, clear and bright. She took a deep breath, looking around the large room to make sure she was truly alone. Then, she sat down. She didn't play the fast, complicated song she had played the first time. And she didn't play the sad, heavy song from last week. She started to play a melody that was simple and pure. It sounded like a lullaby. It was a song that felt like a warm hug. Arthur stood there for a moment, listening. But then, he did something brave. He pushed the curtain aside and walked fully into the room. Mrs. Gable saw him immediately. Her hands jerked, hitting a few wrong notes with a discordant clunk. She started to stand up, her face flushing with that familiar panic. "No, please," Arthur said, lifting his hand to stop her. "Please don't stop." Mrs. Gable hovered halfway off the bench, looking unsure. "I am disturbing your peace, sir. I will go." "You are not disturbing me," Arthur said firmly. He walked slowly across the room and sat in the armchair that faced the piano. He leaned his cane against the side. "I want to hear the rest." "Please." Mrs. Gable looked at him, then at the door, then back at him. She sat down slowly. She didn't close her eyes this time. She looked at Arthur. It made him nervous, having her watch him, but he didn't look away. He wanted her to know he was listening. She began to play again. She picked up the melody where she had left off. The music filled the room, washing away the tension. Arthur leaned back in the chair. He closed his own eyes this time, letting the sound take him away. As he listened, memories came to him. He remembered dancing with his wife in this very room years ago. He remembered the way she laughed when he stepped on her toes. He remembered the smell of her perfume. It should have hurt to remember these things, but it didn't. The music was soft enough to make the memories sweet instead of painful. It was like Mrs. Gable was giving a voice to the things he couldn't say. The song ended softly, trailing off into silence. Arthur opened his eyes. Mrs. Gable was looking at him, her hands resting in her lap. "That was beautiful," Arthur said. "What is it called?" "It is a folk song," she said. "About a bird that flies far away to find a new home, but always comes back to the same tree." Arthur smiled. "That is a good song." He looked around the room. The sun was casting long shadows across the floor. The silence was back, but it was comfortable now. They were two people sitting in a room together, no longer just the boss and the worker. "Can I ask you something?" Arthur said. "Of course, sir." "Why do you stay here?" Arthur asked. "Cleaning for me. I am not an easy man to live with. I am grumpy. I am sad. You could work for a family who is happy, who talks and laughs." Mrs. Gable looked down at her rough hands. She smoothed her apron. "My mother, she always tell me something when I was young. She say, be kind to the broken things, because they are the ones who need the most light." She looked up at Arthur. Her eyes were kind. "This house, it has a sadness. But it has good bones. And you, sir, you are not mean. You are just lonely. Sometimes, it is nice to play for someone who really listens." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He had to swallow hard to keep it down. He looked at this woman, a refugee, a worker, a musician. She had seen the world and its hardships, yet she was the one offering kindness to him. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "Could you?" Arthur started, then stopped. He took a breath and tried again. "Could you teach me? I used to play, a long time ago. But my hands are stiff now. And my heart, it forgets the music." Mrs. Gable's eyes widened. She looked surprised. "You want to learn again?" "I don't want to be just a listener anymore," Arthur said. "I want to make the sound. Even if it is bad. Even if I hit the wrong keys. I think it might be good for me to try." Mrs. Gable smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It transformed her face, making her look years younger. "We all have bad days, Mr. Vance. Even the masters hit wrong notes sometimes." "Yes," she nodded. "I can teach you. But only on Tuesdays. After I finish the floors." "Deal," Arthur said. He actually chuckled. It was a dry, rusty sound, but it was a real laugh. They looked at each other for a moment. There were no more masks. The rich old man and the immigrant maid were gone. In their place were just two people who loved music. "Well," Mrs. Gable said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "The kitchen floor will not mop itself." "Of course," Arthur said. He stood up slowly, grabbing his cane. She picked up her cleaning caddy. She walked to the door, then paused. She turned back to the piano one last time. She reached out and ran her fingers lovingly over the wood. "See you next Tuesday, Mr. Vance." "See you next Tuesday," Arthur replied. He watched her walk down the hallway toward the kitchen. He listened to her footsteps. They didn't sound lonely anymore. They sounded like a rhythm. Arthur turned back to the piano. He walked over to the bench and sat down. He looked at the black and white keys. They were intimidating. They were silent. But he knew that silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibilities. He reached out with his right hand. His finger was shaking just a little bit. He found the middle C key. He pressed it down. Ping. The note rang out, clear and bright. It wasn't a perfect sound. It wasn't a professional performance. But it was a start. It was the sound of life coming back into the house. Arthur smiled. He pressed another key. And then another. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to be afraid of. It felt like a song that was just beginning.